Dr. Don Baham, a community access television producer and the host of an ongoing weekly cable television series, Conversations with Dr. Don. I'm also a retired clinical psychologist and a certified Creole, born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. The program you're about to watch, one of a series of 16 or so individual broadcasts, came about because I wanted to record and share with you highlights of the 2007 Creole Heritage Celebration in the beautiful and historic city of Natchitoches in northwest Louisiana. I wanted to do this because I'd heard good things about this organization of Creoles from a number of sources. An organization that tracks the Creole diaspora? When I grew up in New Orleans in the 30s and 40s, I knew of no formal organization of Creoles like the Creole Heritage Foundation of today. I only knew of the local, more or less, neighborhood social organizations like the Autocrat Club in New Orleans. Well, like so many young Creoles in the 40s, returning from military service to other parts of the country, I lost touch to a large degree with the New Orleans Creole-style community. Now, the city of Los Angeles Creole community in the 50s through the 70s provided a modicum of Creole community, but nothing like the Creole community in New Orleans in the 30s and 40s. And then moving out of Los Angeles proper into the larger Los Angeles area suburban community further isolated me from my cultural upbringing, and not to mention moving to Oregon 13 years ago. Ever find yourself in a place where you see someone that has a look or a flavor about them that suggests that they might be a Creole or a whatever, only to discover that it is more how they look physically that caused your misperception? Now, of course, I love where I live now in the rainy Pacific Northwest, but if there are any Creoles up here, I haven't seen any. So that's why I decided that I had to come to the celebration. And I'm so very glad I did. I can't put into words the feelings of joy and connection that I felt at the celebration and am still feeling today. That feeling of joy and connection was certainly encouraged and facilitated by the warm and gracious welcome and ongoing support and assistance of Mrs. Janet Rabare-Colson, the Executive Director of the NSU Creole Heritage Center, and her eager, dedicated staff. I can't thank Mrs. Colson and her staff enough. I believe that the flavor and essence of what it's like to be Creole comes through in the speeches and presentations that you will see and hear in the series of broadcasts that comprise the complete program. I believe that whether or not you're a Creole, you're bound to learn more about us, our heritage, and our love of life. I hope that after viewing any or all of this series of programs, you viewers might become encouraged to find more of the fun and love of life in your own particular culture. So, enough of my talk, and on with the program.
My father, some of you may know my dad, who was a civil rights attorney and a lawyer in New Orleans for 47 years. But what a lot of people don't know is that he was a historian. He was also a person very interested in his Creole culture, the culture of Louisiana. And in addition to his tireless civil rights work, he collected and preserved many valuable documents that people gave to him or that he found in the attic or the storage rooms of the Custom House on Canal Street. He worked as a clerk, liquidator, at the Customs House when he came back from Howard University with a law degree in 1927. And because black lawyers were very few in the South and earned a very meager living, he had to supplement his income with a paying job. In the early 1930s, he was given 2 large ledgers that contained the Laysonnelle's poems, which were written by 17 free men of color in 1845, that most of us know nothing about because we were never taught about the literature of the Creole Louisiana during the, what I call the Creole Renaissance in the mid-1800s. The second volume contained poetry and essays. The person who copied all of these writings, these poems and essays, all in French, in very fancy curly-Q holographic writing, was a man called Pierre-Aristide Desdunes, who was the brother of Rudolph Desdunes, who was one of the men, also a lawyer, who organized a committee of citizens that sponsored the Plessy versus Ferguson case in New Orleans. And we have a relative of Homer Plessy sitting in the audience that some of you should talk to. Just raise your hand, Ms. Plessy, that I want to talk to, because this is a significant American historical event. Okay, my story, how do I enter into all of this? I knew nothing of anything that I've talked about. I knew none of this history. I knew nothing about these ledgers. And a number of years ago in the 1990s, before my mother died, my father had died in 1972. And my mother said to me, "There's something I want you to do." She said, "There's some old documents that your father had, and we don't know where they are. I'd like you to find them." And in those documents are the Laysonnelle's poems. And I saw on television recently where a copy of the book, Laysonnelle's, was auctioned at Park Bernet Gallery for a large amount of money. We're not interested in the money, but we want to find the documents because they're significant in the Creole history of Louisiana. I promised my mother I would do that. And my mother died, and time passed on, and about 6 years later, I said, you know, I made a promise, I should try to keep this promise. And I went to my father's papers at the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans and found out that these documents were part of a book called Creole Voices that was published in 1945 as a centennial to the Laysonnelle's poems, but that the original documents seem to have disappeared. However, with my sister Elise, raise your hand, who's here today. She lives in Maryland. We were in Washington, D.C., and the trail of my father's papers led me to Howard University, to the Moreland Spingarn collection, which is the oldest black archive in the United States. And we found the documents there, and it took a year for me and the support of a good legal advisor to get those documents returned to my family. And I brought them back to New York, and would show them to people in New Orleans, and was looking for an archive, a safe place where they could be used to continue to teach people about the Creole history of Louisiana. Last February, Dana Kress and I, Dana Kress is from Centenary University in Shreveport, and he's going to tell you what he has been doing with the smaller volume of the documents. But my family gave those documents to the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is an organization that collects, preserves, and distributes and disseminates historical information regarding New Orleans. And they have always been, in my view, an uptown sort of white organization, but in the last few years have become more inclusive and really are reaching out to all of the people of Louisiana to be a part of this wonderful sharing and collection of Creole and Louisiana history. What I want to just give you is a brief background of Pierre-Aristide Desdunes, and Karen Cozy Bell, who is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. Dana will tell you what she's doing. She's part of this project that we're involved in. And I'll just tell you briefly some of the stuff that she has discovered recently about Pierre-Aristide Desdunes. Pierre-Aristide Desdunes was born in 1844 to Henriette Gilliard and Pierre Jérémie Desdunes. His mother and father were both free persons of African descent and natives of Louisiana. He was the eldest child in a large family of 7 children, and his brother, Rodolphe Lucien Desdunes, was the second eldest. Aristide attended the Catholic Institute for Indigent Orphans and received an excellent education. Although he would have clearly preferred a life of the mine, he learned carpentry and supported himself in that trade throughout his life. He served as a private in the Native Guard Regiment and remained in the Army until the end of the Civil War. In 1873, he married Louise Mathilde Denenberg of St. Charles Parish. In the 1890s, Aristide joined with his brother Rodolphe Lucien Desdunes, Lois Martinet, and other Creole activists to challenge state-enforced segregation, a struggle that culminated in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, which started the separate but equal philosophy in the United States. Aristide died in 1918 of a stroke after suffering a long illness. We are trying to find people who are related to the Desdunes to try to find who gave those documents to my father, and we think it may have been Aristide's wife because she died in 1936 in New Orleans. Without any further ado, I give you Dana Kress, Centenary College.
It's good to be here with you today. I want to share some of the poetry that was originally written in French that I've translated into English because it's part of American culture and history, and I think that you'll find that Desdunes' words echo powerfully even today. I want to give you a little background on him too. Over the course of the 19th century, Louisiana's Creoles of color scored numerous firsts in the realm of American literature by persons of color. Their accomplishments in poetry, the short story, the theater, and journalism, echoed by the creation of one of the first literary reviews in the state, the first anthology of poetry, and the first black daily newspaper in the United States, offer ample proof of the sophistication of these Francophone writers. The brilliant careers in poetry and drama enjoyed by Creole exiles in France, writers such as Victor Séjour, Camille Thierry, and Pierre Dalcourt, shown as glaring examples to all Louisiana Francophones of color that it was not the man who felled his country, but the country who felled the man. For Creole and black writers who either chose or were forced to remain in Louisiana because of financial considerations after the Civil War, the newspapers of the period quickly became the forum of preference for their social activism. The first of these newspapers that played a significant role in Louisiana was the radical publication L'Union, the Union, founded at the beginning of the Civil War by Louis-Charles Roudanet. Its stance was both abolitionist and revolutionary. Renamed the Tribune, La Tribune de la Nouvelle-Orléans, in 1864, this newspaper, the first black daily newspaper in the United States, included ample selections of poetry and serialized short fiction by Creole writers. During Reconstruction, the paper became the official organ of those advocating radical change, and for the paper's Creole readers, literature became a highly political and socially engaged act. The poem To Father Chocarne, published in the Tribune on Tuesday, April 16, 1867, offers an excellent example of this social engagement. The fact that the author conceals his identity behind the pen name Pierre-L'Ermite, the leader of the First Crusade to the Holy Land, reveals the true nature of the Creole crusade for social equality. To Father Chocarne. My most reverend father, an obscure and lowly Negro, listened overwhelmed last night to your radiant words. He felt the light of faith shine within his soul. Rejecting his consoling doubts, he sought the cross once more. But this man, O most reverend father, listening, transported, lost in the glorious tumult of your austere words, this man lifted his eyes and heart from the world, and the supreme call, the divine whisper he had heard stirring within his soul, vanished like a dying flame, like a fugitive memory, pursued by the realities of the world. Because he remembered that even in this church, Christ's apostles permit men to scorn, to banish to distant pews, not great sinners nor impure tyrants, but throngs of wretched poor whose only fault, whose only crime in the eyes of white men who oppress them is to have black skin. You must speak out against such injustice. As Christ drove the merchants from the temple, you too must drive out evil men who seek in you an accomplice. Thinking of the obscure and lowly poet, captivated by your radiant words, you must tell them, O most reverend father, that a white man who does not want a black man to be his brother loses the sacred right to call God his father. As the struggle for civil rights became more fierce, the articles in literature became so militant that finally the line between literature and armed struggle became blurred. The breaking point came when the Constitutional Convention, meeting on July 30th, 1866 in the Mechanics' Institute, advanced the cause of universal suffrage. The news spread rapidly, and almost immediately, an army of angry whites sprang up and converged on the offices of the Tribune. The newspaper survived, protected by an army of troops of color. These events helped shape a new generation of crusaders, and one of the most important, yet unknown, is Pierre-Aristide Desdunes. It's hardly surprising that Desdunes began what was to become one of the major literary accomplishments of Creole Louisiana in 1866, the same year as the attack on the Tribune. After all, the family was destined to play a major role in the fight for civil rights in Louisiana. His younger brother, Rodolphe Desdunes, was a member of the Comité des Citoyens who took the Plessy versus Ferguson case to the Supreme Court, and Daniel Desdunes, most frequently reported to be his brother or nephew, but whom more recent research by Karen Cosibel has shown to be his uncle, played an important role in the same struggle. The patriarch of the family, Jeremiah Desdunes, had come from Haiti. Another Desdunes, Émile, born in New Orleans, returned to Haiti for his education and served as an agent there to facilitate immigration from Louisiana to Haiti during the last years of the 1850s. Desdunes' manuscript is comprised of two ledgers written between 1866 and 1894. The larger of the ledgers contains Les Sennelles, and it was that version that Coleman used to establish the text of Creole Voices in 1845. With few exceptions, the poets of Les Sennelles do not directly address their tenuous situation in a South that was ever increasingly hostile to the case to which they belonged. However, poems such as those by Camille Thierry, carefully transcribed by Desdunes in his ledgers, offer portraits of conflicted individuals who suffer in a case halfway between white and slave, having certain rights but not totally accepted, marginalized despite their ability, their intellect, and their fortune. If Thierry does not attack society itself, he does attack its values that rewarded racial discrimination. In a poem entitled The Sea Captain, the pilot indicates the solution for those who refuse to be passive victims of his society's racist attitudes, and goes so far as to threaten violence. Speaking of his beloved's father, he says, "If he dares confront me, this old man you call your father, my heart will race and my hungry dagger will take him down, my dear. This old man scorned my race and cursed our marriage. Thus, for this hoary fool, I'll erase every human care." Now that's pretty powerful words for a man of color to be speaking in 1845, to dare say that he will not stand for a white man to allow him to love a woman of color. Desdunes clearly understood Thierry's poetic cry because as a 19th century Creole of color, he knew that no matter how gifted and diligent he might have been, he would be forced to live within the constraints of his fate as a second-class citizen. Such is the troubling context that underpins the poetic inspiration of Les Sennelles and explains why Desdunes prefaced his own creative endeavors with the poetry of those who had come before him. Indeed, the 50 original poems by Desdunes contained in the first ledger represent a major contribution to Creole studies. While Coleman included a few of these works in Creole Voices, he chose to include only those poems where there was no hint of social critique, and even suggests that Desdunes' poetry tends towards the frivolous. Such clearly was not Desdunes' intentions, and in his own introduction to his poetry, written in 1890, he states, "Fellow citizens, let us remember that it is through unity that everything that is infinite rises up, and that discord causes those things that falsely proclaim their greatness to crumble away. Let us hold in scorn every putrid swamp of every prejudice and close our ranks beneath the banner of fraternity. The duty of every Louisianian who claims to be a patriot is to foster unity. If the young generation of writers is afraid to open the discussion, let the old guard show the way. There are many pioneers among us who dare to think and fight." Many of the works seem to have had an autobiographical or personal element. Perhaps none are more poignant and less frivolous than the poem Curious Dreams, in which the protagonist's mother sings a lullaby to her child that clearly destroys all the child's illusions about the world into which she, as a person of color, has been born. Curious Dreams. One sunlit April evening when I was just a child, my mother sang me a bitter song that troubled my sleep that night. My ideals beckoned me onward, yet those who believed in happiness, in love, and dishonor are dead. Madmen, wicked men, those who sold black souls throughout the earth, those impure and trembling men are dead. What will become of those courtiers of pleasure and derision whose consoling illusions are dead? For me, no more suitors. All the strong, all the soldiers, destroyed by duty, all the poets, those princes of dream, are dead. May the peaceful night open her doors for these young and glorious heroes who are dead and whose gentle-eyed lovers are dead. Beneath blood-soaked skies one April evening when I was just a child, my mother sang me a bitter song, and I cradled my dreams and strangled them. We can only wonder why Coleman chose not to include such powerful works in his Creole voices. Perhaps he was afraid of their powerful imagery, very radical even in the 1940s, or felt that it was one of the poems he considered too moralizing. However, many of the works show that Desdunes clearly understood his mission to transform society and to bring into existence a new world based on personal worth. The following extract of the poem, Thoughts of a Slave Soldier, written shortly after the Civil War, seemed to foretell Desdunes' family involvement with the Citizens Committee and the Plessy case. Thoughts of a Slave Soldier. To weep while the world laughs, to weep while the world sings, to smother within our heart every great and noble thought, to ceaselessly feel the biting whip at our backs snapping in the hands of a heartless tyrant, to weep, yet smother every hint of a sob, to poison the master's joy. Such is the destiny of the African slave, and I remember it well. Such was my own lot. While the world echoes the song of life, he sings death's refrain in muffled tones. A degraded man, neither virtue nor remorse cry out within his enchained soul. May the Lord bring me forth, as he did Moses, from this impure miasma where dwell squatting slaves, and anoint my mission to awaken virtue electrified within flames inside their downtrodden hearts. Stand with me, noble sons of Africa, and if you see our torch grow pale, do not fear its momentary flickering. A brighter sun will be reborn within our teeming ranks. In waging this battle, I do not fear unleashing white reprisals upon black men, because I feel, boiling within my veins of iron, a creative power giving birth to worlds. He was familiar with and sympathetic to the writings of Karl Marx, a debt that has never been recorded among Creole thinkers, but which nonetheless is well documented in his ledgers. The clearest link to Marx can undoubtedly be traced to his connection with a French-born writer, Charles Testu. Testu took up the struggle for equal rights, and his ideas apparently gave a powerful philosophic underpinning to the Creole struggle against Jim Crow's Louisiana. Desdunes acknowledges this debt and shows a deep understanding of Marxism in the essays found in the smaller of the two ledgers. These works offer a remarkable window into the revolutionary thinking that inspired the Comité des Citoyens and ranged from a Marxist analysis of capitalist America to a study of French revolutionary and socially engaged writers. The debt to Testu is most directly acknowledged in Desdunes' essay, A Comparison of American Capitalists with the French Bourgeoisie. Written in the form of a letter to the editor was Charles Testu. Desdunes probably intended the essay to be published in Testu's newspaper, Equity. Equity is in financial equity, but equity also is in social equality. Speaking of the French Revolution, Desdunes states, when the Third Estate defeated the clergy and nobility in 1789 and proved to them that this scorned caste was everything when it had been counted as nothing for centuries, it accomplished one of the greatest revolutions in history. At the time, they sought only to abolish privileges and to put an end to despotism. But when this same Third Estate took its real name, that of the bourgeoisie, and took power in 1830, putting on the throne a king in its own image, it put a bourgeois king. It wrapped itself in power, excluding the real workers, and became as odious and even more ridiculous than the former nobility, because it reestablished for its own profit a feudality and system of privilege that in the earlier revolution it had fought so valiantly against. It failed in 1848, and the proclamation of universal suffrage was the supreme homage given to the ideals of democracy. Clearly, this didn't silence parasitic bourgeois claims to power, but it did remove a means of oppression and the power to erect immovable barriers for the masses and people of color. Pierre-Aristide Desdunes seems to have withdrawn from the struggle with the loss of the Plessy versus Ferguson case when that case ensconced segregation as the law of the land. That had happened 4 years before Louisiana revised its constitution so as to disenfranchise a large minority of its citizens. The group had tried their best to achieve equality, but had failed. However, until his death in 1918, Desdunes remained confident that justice would eventually triumph. The Édition Tintamarre, the heritage language press of Centenary College of Louisiana, will publish Desdunes' complete works in 3 volumes over the next 2 years. The printing of the work is being funded by a grant from the Newton and Rosa Smith Charitable Trust. Newton Smith was born a slave in 1859 and died 3 days short of his 100th birthday in 1959. Through his hard work, he acquired extensive land holdings in northern Louisiana. And before he died, he gave the land upon which Southern University and the Newton Smith School in Shreveport stand today. He also left provisions to establish a trust to help in the education of young people. With this grant, Newton Smith, a man of color who could neither read nor write, gives voice to his contemporary, Pierre-Aristide Desdunes, a man of color who worked his entire life so that others could accomplish what was denied to him. The examples of men such as Pierre-Aristide Desdunes, Newton Smith, and A.P. Thiroux, the man responsible for saving the Desdunes manuscripts from oblivion, leave a legacy for all those who struggle against oppression in the world. Desdunes' last poem that I'm going to give you today, his Elegy, written just after the Civil War, seems to celebrate the lives of such men who fought the good fight and who left a legacy for those who seek to understand the world. Elegy. An angelus resounds from afar in the fading light. As cattle abandon their fields and pastures and peaceful laborers return to their village, I remain alone, all alone with the night. Already twilight grows dark and shadowy, the air enshrouded in deepest silence. From afar waft songs of a lovelorn shepherd who pours out his sorrows of inconstant love. Near the old tower in the shade of elms, a solitary owl cries out to the moon, offering his empire to this fateful moment, while limpid glimmerings wander across the roofs. And yonder, beneath the yews and stooping willows, lay scattered graves marked and honored by immortal weeds. No marble or bronze proclaim these fallen heroes, eternally ennobled in their nameless graves. Neither the perfumed breeze with all its seductions, nor warbling birds impassioned by spring, nor the noble cock, nor the strident bugle can waken these sleepers from their tranquil slumber. They will never return to their distant hearths, nor taste pleasure in the arms of cherished wives. Vanished are the children who ran to embrace these beckoning fathers after the labors of the day. All the glorious banners and intoxicating power, strength and beauty innocence and grace, all swept away by this eternal machine that cuts a path to glory through the gates of death. And you, wealthy masters of the world, turn away your scornful gaze from these nameless graves and read, engraved in gold and decaying finery, the anathema that adorns your glorious mausoleums. Of what use is your statue glorifying death? What charm has sculpted honor over trembling dust? Your flattery is nothing but a flickering chimera, powerless to break destiny's spell. Perhaps here lies an abandoned and penniless lover who cherished heaven and burned with passion, who would have left this world a legacy of poetry purified in the forges of his soul. Like a pure jewel beneath bottomless waves, like a sweet flower withering away in the woods, virtue in this world is often trampled, innocence smothered in these ghastly miasma. Perhaps here lies an Ibsen, a Milton, a Cromwell worthy of the tears of his nation. But of what use is their silent and nameless glory, swallowed up, unremembered in eternal night? For them, far from the tumult and the resounding struggle, instructed in virtue, their richest treasure. This valley was always a beckoning oasis where gold held only impotent charms. Do not insult these cold fields of bone, but read, engraved upon these scattered rocks, read jumbled verses that implore of passers-by, a sigh, a tear, prayers uttered to the earth. Every heart grown still beats within another heart. Every fugitive soul resides within another soul. And in our very ashes burns a secret flame where nature dwells and laments our pain. Thank you. Do you have any questions for AP or myself?
I know we're all kind of... I just wanted to say one thing. Don't go away. These documents from 1845 were preserved for 50 years at Howard University, where they were never accessed by anyone. They were put there for safekeeping after my father and his friends published a small book, Creole Voices. With Katrina and the horrors that followed, many of us have valuable historical documents, family pictures, birth certificates, all things that lead to historical discovery. We should not keep them in our homes. We should put them in a collection where they can be protected and used and distributed so that people who follow us will know the history that we were never taught. We must do that. And you find your own archive or find your own organization, but there are more and more people investing in this kind of ongoing historical collection, and I urge you, because you have valuable information, to put it in a place where it can be used, because once we all go, people will throw it away or devalue it. So that's a very strong statement. And if there are there any questions at all? Okay, then we're done. Thank you very much.
One thing that we didn't say, since we have just a second, I wanted to let you know what all is in these documents. These documents had really never been looked at before. I gave you about 8 poems today and put them in kind of a context. There are hundreds of poems in the whole document. These are major voices by many different Creoles of color. They're all Creoles of color. These were Creoles of color who, after the Civil War, self-identified as black. lived as, at the time, legally considered black. Now, if you consider them to be Creoles of color, it's a remarkable document in itself. But within this document, if you want to look at them as historic documents that form part of African American history too, and they do have a foot in that heritage, they represent the crown jewel of 19th century African American and Creole literature. Because it's not just the poetry. There are 15 short stories that I didn't even bring you, including several of the first short stories ever written. 2 short stories in there are by men of color who served in the Civil War and tell short stories about the Civil War. That's unparalleled in American literature. And in addition to all that short fiction, there is also approximately 20 essays, and these 20 essays are these essays date from 1867 and they end in 1894. These essays predate almost any single essay on the black experience in the United States written by a Creole of color. But this is a priceless document, and I know from having worked with all this material that many of you have documents, frequently probably written in French, that you cannot read. And because you can't read them, you may have thought these were just your great-grandmother's documents. Some of these are very important. Do something with them, please. Save it. Yes?
And put them in English so we can all have the benefit of reading them and publish them.
The question is it going to be translated into English? Some of them have been published in English already by the Southern Quarterly, and we are actually working on a translation of poetry, a global translation, so that it will be an anthology of poets by Creoles of color that date from roughly 1836 to 1890s. And in order to do that right, that just takes a while. Yeah.
So where can they obtain additional information or?
You could ask me for a copy of this paper if you want additional information. You could contact Southern Quarterly Journal, which has reprinted these poems in the original French and in English. I actually cut out some of them today because we were a little pressed with time. So they have more in that journal, and Centenary College will be publishing these. And since you're all from Louisiana, it's just up the street, and you can get in touch with anybody at Centenary and get them that way.
What does that mean, Creoles of color versus Creole? What's the difference?
In 19th century New Orleans, you know, words change meaning, right? And in 19th century New Orleans, when people said Creole, it was generally thought to be Creoles of European descent. And over a period of time, the word Creole has come to mean Creole of color. So in 19th century New Orleans, there were Creoles of color versus Creoles who were strictly born in the New World of parents from the Old World. Any other questions?
Look to your left.
Yes. I can't hear you. Yes, there are white Creoles today.
I just wanted to mention in my parish, at least in Pointe-Coupee, there are a lot of people of strict European ancestry who identify themselves as Creole. And they speak the Creole language, with the Creole morphology and syntax and everything. And they are European. We are also some mixed and some that are straight European, but Creole is very ambiguous.
It's very ambiguous. And what I've noticed in just the last 10 years, more and more when people say, the meaning of the word has even changed in the last 10 years. It seems to me, 10 years ago, when you said Creole, it was still much more, many people thought of it as Creoles of European descent. Today, when you say the word Creole, I think this room is a good example of what Creole is.
Are the short stories available that you mentioned?
They've been transcribed and they're being corrected. You know, these documents are in very bad condition, and he wrote with essentially a quill pen and couldn't go backwards, and so you have to sometimes decipher what the text is. So yes, they're going to be published. All of it's going to be published. Some of the about 15 short stories by Creoles of color have been published by Centenary already. And you can go to www.centenary.edu/editions, and you will find Laysonnel and a book of poetry by Camille Thierry, which is bilingual. All that has been translated. And so some of that material has already been done. Did I answer your question?
The same people will publish these short stories that you say,
Centenary.
Yes.
Centenary.edu?
It's centenary.edu.
Right, okay.
And you are at Centenary? Or you
I'm
located?
at Centenary. I'm easily located at Centenary. DKRESS at centenary.edu. CENTENARY.
I just want to thank AP and the professor for doing such a wonderful job in bringing us those moments of antiquity and having translated them and calling our attention to it. For those, the rest of us who are from Louisiana, I don't know if you've experienced this whenever you travel. Somebody says Louisiana, oh, Cajun. And I say, wait a minute, we're not a Cajun, I'm a Creole. Well, what's the difference? I says, well, Cajuns take a roadkill and lace it with cayenne. We cook from scratch and we use a stove.
Thank you again. You know, and if you've ever you wonder why perhaps we have quest for knowledge, you know, why you want your children to be educated, think of your bloodline and think of your roots. You know, you think of these people and the time that they were in and how they hungered for knowledge and the beautiful words and all that were written and how educated they were. It has to have something to do with us and how we strive for education and how we so want our children to be a part of that.